The rain had arrived without warning. Chicago in the early breath of summer was supposed to be restless with humidity, heavy with the fragrance of magnolia trees and the low hum of traffic on Michigan Avenue. But the skies cracked open that evening, as if the heavens had chosen a different script. The downpour began, not with thunder, but with a hush, soft and deliberate, like a city exhaling secrets it had been forced to hold too long. From the 34th floor of a glass tower overlooking the river, the skyline blurred into streaks of white and amber. The towers of steel and glass monuments to ambition were softened into watercolor shadows by the rivulets running down the window. Inside that penthouse, Stella Taylor stood barefoot on polished limestone floors, her reflection faint against the storm. The apartment stretched in silence, soaring ceilings, abstract art on white walls, leather furniture arranged for an audience that never came. It was vast, designed to impress, and yet hollow, a museum where echoes of loneliness lingered longer than footsteps. For months, silence had been her closest companion. Her phone, forgotten on the counter, vibrated once. Just once. No call, no second attempt. Only a single message arriving with the bluntness of a verdict. She crossed the room with the grace of someone already expecting disappointment, though not knowing in what shape it might come. The screen lit her face with a sterile glow. Adrian Stewart. I'm engaged to Claire. Let's get a divorce. 7 words. Cold, exact, merciless. The device slipped slightly in her hand. For a moment it seemed as though her body might tremble, but her lips held steady, her breath barely shifted. Only her chest betrayed her, a tightening, a sharp pressure, like iron bars pressed against fragile bone. She had known. Of course she had known. You do not live beside a man for 3 years without sensing when love almost politely slipped out of the room. She had smelled the perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his shirts. She had grown accustomed to dinners eaten alone at a table set for 2. She had learned the hollow cadence of laughter, echoing faintly from calls he never explained. Knowledge does not soften the blade of truth. Her hand lowered the phone to the marble counter with deliberate precision, as if she were rehearsing a scene she had always known would arrive. Not rage, not disbelief, simply the performance of inevitability. She walked to the mahogany desk at the far wall, its surface untouched by clutter, a place she rarely visited. From the second drawer, she withdrew a folder slim and waiting. Inside, a single sheet of paper, bearing 2 names, hers and his, and an empty line awaiting signatures. The divorce papers had been ready for weeks, perhaps months. She had filled them out in silence on nights when Adrian came home too late, or not at all. The act of preparation had been a quiet survival, a way of reclaiming a measure of control in a life spiraling toward invisibility. Now, with the storm thrumming against glass like a heartbeat too large for its cage, she sat at the desk. She uncapped the fountain pen. Her handwriting flowed across the page, steady, elegant, mercilessly calm. No smudge, no hesitation, no tears. When she rose, she left the paper at the center of the dining table, where they had once toasted anniversaries with champagne, where empty plates had grown more familiar than conversation. Besides, she removed the diamond ring from her finger. It glittered under the pendant light, a final jewel offered to a silence that had become unbearable. She studied it briefly, not with longing, but with a detached kind of reverence. That ring had once been a promise whispered under fireworks at Navy Pier, a promise that passion could build permanence. Now it was a shard of memory, fragile as glass, glimmering even as it lay abandoned. Her suitcase was already packed. Only one small, discreet, almost defiant in its refusal to carry excess. A few changes of clothes. Her passport. A leather-bound notebook filled with half-formed plans. A photograph of herself at 20, smiling with a confidence she had misplaced somewhere along the way. She walked through the penthouse one last time. The living room, where they had once celebrated Adrian's first billion-dollar merger champagne, spilling over crystal flutes. The kitchen, where she had clumsily baked him a birthday cake that grew stale overnight when he never returned home to taste it. The bedroom, vast and cold, where she had learned to sleep, curled tightly on one side of the bed, never daring to cross the invisible border that separated her from his indifference. Every object whispered a memory. None of them begged to be kept. At the doorway she paused. The rain outside softened no longer a storm, but a drizzle. Delicate taps against the glass, like fingertips reminding her of the world waiting beyond. She inhaled deeply, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door. She did not look back. By the time Adrian returned, the apartment would be silent. Adrian Stewart entered hours later with the confidence of a man convinced the world bent to his will. His tuxedo jacket hung carelessly over one arm. His tie loosened the scent of champagne clinging to him like a crown. At his side during the evening, Claire Whitmore had smiled for cameras, her engagement ring flashing beneath chandeliers. Together, they had been celebrated, toasted, envied the heir to a Wall Street dynasty, and the daughter of one of America's most powerful families, a perfect alliance wrapped in glitter and strategy. The elevator chimed, doors sliding open to reveal his sanctuary. Yet something was wrong. The air felt different too, still, too deliberate. He tossed his keys onto the counter, waiting for the soft murmur of Stella's voice, the faint steps of her bare feet, the subtle aroma of jasmine tea she always brewed late at night. Instead, absence greeted him thick and impenetrable. His eyes caught the dining table. The single sheet of paper, her signature, graceful, final. Beside it, the wedding ring he had once placed on her finger beneath the vaulted arches of St. Patrick's Cathedral. For a heartbeat, his chest stuttered something unbidden, a faint ache pressed against him. But pride is a swifter current than remorse. He poured a scotch, the amber liquid burning his throat as he muttered, "She was never meant for this world." Stella was ordinary, sweet but ordinary. Claire understands ambition. Claire belongs here. He repeated it once, twice, until the words rang hollow even to himself. And when he lay in bed, the sheets cold beside him, sleep refused to come. The rain against the windows tugged him backward toward memories he had buried. Stella curled into him on quiet nights. Stella's laughter was soft and unguarded. Stella's whispered dreams of building something of her own. He had silenced those dreams and silenced her. And now she was gone. Across the city, Stella hailed a cab. The driver asked for an address. She gave him one she had memorized for weeks. A modest apartment on the south side, rented under another name. As the taxi pulled away, she rested her forehead against the cool glass. The city lights bled into rivers of gold and red. Her chest warred between grief and relief. She was not leaving because she no longer loved him. She was leaving because she loved herself enough to stop bleeding for a man who refused to see her worth. It rained until dawn. The first morning without Adrian began in silence. Stella woke in a one-bedroom apartment that smelled faintly of paint and dust. The mattress was thin, the curtains uneven. The heater groaned when the pipes sputtered awake. And yet it was hers. She sat at the edge of the bed, listening to the symphony of a city unfiltered, the subway rumbling below the honk of impatient drivers, a neighbor's baby crying through paper-thin walls. Her finger, once encircled by a band of diamonds, was bare. She touched the skin lightly, reacquainting herself with freedom. The world had not ended. It had only begun again quietly. Atlanta smelled different, not of champagne marble polish or fresh roses replaced every morning by unseen hands in a penthouse high above the city. No, the air here carried the earthiness of rain-soaked streets, fried chicken wafting from a diner down the block, magnolia blossoms hidden in small neighborhood yards. It was ordinary, stubbornly, unapologetically ordinary. And it was Stella Taylor's new beginning. Her apartment sat in a red brick building where the paint had begun to peel around the windows. The stairwell creaked. The elevator was forever out of service, and neighbors' voices carried through the walls, arguments, laughter music too loud at midnight. The first night she arrived suitcase in hand. She stood in the doorway of the small one-bedroom and let the quiet press against her chest. The mattress was thin, the curtains crooked. The heater exhaled with a tired groan. But when she lay down, for the first time in years, the silence belonged to her. It was not weighted with absence. It was not the echo of footsteps that never returned. It was simply hers. Every morning, she rose with no champagne flute, waiting no assistant to coordinate her hours. She brewed coffee on a second-hand machine that sputtered like it might collapse, ate toast too crisp because she had forgotten to lower the heat, and sat by the narrow window overlooking a parking lot. Freedom, she discovered, had the taste of burnt bread and lukewarm coffee. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even comfortable. But it was honest. Her savings, carefully hidden away during the years of silence, were modest. She couldn't afford to sit idle. Within a week, she found a temporary position at a small translation office on Peachtree Street. The pay was unremarkable, the office crowded, but words were a currency she knew well. English, French, and Spanish languages she had once polished into social ornament became survival tools. Her colleagues barely noticed her at first. She was polite and quiet, arriving early and leaving late. Yet she carried herself with a grace that even fluorescent lights and stacks of paperwork couldn't erase. The younger interns whispered about her posture and voice, as if she had entered the wrong world. But Stella ignored their curiosity. She translated contracts, technical manuals, and advertising slogans. None of it thrilled her. Still, there was a satisfaction in knowing that the work she produced belonged entirely to her. The paycheck bore only her name. Nights were harder. The city outside pulsed with life cars rushing along highways, laughter spilling from restaurants, music vibrating from clubs. Inside her apartment, the quiet sometimes grew unbearable. She would sit at the small table, the glow of a single lamp spilling over an open notebook. Her pen would scratch across the pages, not with diary entries of heartbreak, but with lists, fragments, ambitions she was afraid to name aloud. Study again. Finance. Economics. Build something. Don't forget you are more than someone's silence. Her handwriting carried determination even when her heart did not. Loneliness was a creature that stalked her. It waited in corners pressed against her ribs when she lay in bed. Some evenings, she would place her ear against the wall and listen to the muffled sounds of life spilling from other apartments. A mother scolds her child. A young couple arguing about money. A man laughing at his own television show. These imperfect symphonies reminded her she was not invisible only alone. But loneliness was also a kind of forge. In the absence of another's voice, Stella began to hear her own. In late September, 4 months after she left Chicago, she attended a seminar at Emory University. She had seen the announcement on a bulletin board outside the library, Global Investment Strategies Navigating Emerging Markets. The words tugged at something dormant inside her. Once she had studied finance at university, before she married Adrian, before she convinced herself that his empire would be enough for both of them. The thought of walking into a hall filled with strangers, of reclaiming a past she had abandoned, both thrilled and terrified her. That evening she dressed in black trousers from a thrift store, a blouse ironed to crispness, and a notebook tucked under her arm. The auditorium was filled with men in tailored suits, women with laptops on their knees. Students scribbling hurried notes. Stella slid into the back row unnoticed. The speaker was a tall man with silver at his temples, and the calm authority of someone who had seen markets rise and fall without losing his footing. Marcus Reed is a senior consultant known for advising firms across Asia and Africa. His voice carried effortlessly through the hall. He spoke of resilience, risk, and reward, and the necessity of vision that could bend but not break. Stella's hand moved feverishly across the page, capturing his words and the meaning beneath them. When the lecture ended, applause filled the room. Attendees gathered at the front, eager to shake hands to be noticed. Stella lingered at the edge, her notebook pressed to her chest. She almost turned to leave, but something more substantial than hesitation urged her forward. She waited until the crowd thinned. Then she approached the stage with a breath that felt heavier than it should. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, her voice steady, though her palms trembled. "How does someone with no capital, no connections begin again?" He studied her. His gaze did not skim past her, as others often had. He looked directly into her eyes, as though measuring the weight of her question. He said quietly, "You begin by refusing to believe those things matter more than your mind." The words lodged inside her like a seed. Later that night, she found an email in her inbox. "I noticed your notes. They were sharper than most of the questions I received. If you're serious, I can recommend resources for the CFA exam. Marcus Reed." For the first time in months, Stella smiled into the glow of her screen. The weeks that followed tested her resolve. Her days began before sunrise. She translated documents at the office, survived on instant noodles and granola bars, then caught the bus to the library. There, she spread textbooks across the table. Finance, accounting, economics. She copied formulas until her hand cramped underlined passages, until the ink faded. When exhaustion pressed down, she whispered, "Not for him, for me." On weekends, she sold pieces of jewelry, gifts from a past life that no longer fit the woman she was becoming. With each sale, the weight of her old identity loosened. She used the money to pay exam fees, to buy second-hand textbooks, to keep the small apartment where she fought each night for a future that still felt distant. Sometimes she fell asleep over her notes. The janitor would wake her gently, and she would thank him with a tired smile before gathering her papers. She failed her first practice exam. The result gutted her, left her curled on her bed with tears dampening her pillow. But the next morning, she returned to the library. Determination can rise even from the ashes of defeat. One evening, as autumn deepened, she sat at her table in the apartment surrounded by scribbled notes. Rain tapped softly at the window, less violent than the storm that had ended her marriage, more like a quiet reminder of the cycles that cleanse. She picked up the photograph of herself at 20. In it, she was radiant, fearless eyes, filled with the confidence of youth. The girl in the picture had believed in her own brilliance. Stella had lost that girl somewhere between the glittering halls of Adrian Stewart's empire and the silence of her abandonment. Now, staring at the image, she whispered, "I will find you again." By December, she registered for the CFA exam. The decision felt monumental, not because it guaranteed success, but because it marked commitment. She was no longer waiting for life to choose her path. She was choosing. Marcus's occasional emails kept her grounded. He sent reading lists, advice, and words of encouragement, never cloaked in pity. His presence was not overwhelming. It was steady like a lighthouse glimpsed in stormy waters, distant, unwavering guiding. On New Year's Eve, fireworks erupted across Atlanta. From her window, Stella watched colors scatter against the dark sky. She was alone with no champagne and no man beside her. Yet in the quiet of her modest apartment, surrounded by textbooks and scribbled notes, she felt something she had not in years: hope. The year ahead would demand more than she thought she had to give. But for the first time, she welcomed the challenge. Starting from zero did not mean emptiness. It meant possibility. And Stella Taylor, once invisible, was ready to claim it. The winter in Atlanta was not cruel, unlike the steel-gray storms of Chicago that once rattled against glass towers. Here the cold arrived in whispers, thin layers of frost on car windshields, the occasional flurry dissolving before it touched the ground. But for Stella Taylor, the season felt harsher than any storm. She had chosen a path lined not with comfort, but with fire. The CFA exam loomed like a mountain rising before her, its peak obscured by fog. Every statistic she read reminded her of the odds only a fraction of candidates passed on their first attempt. Most failed. Many surrendered. But Stella had no room for surrender. Her mornings began before dawn. At 5:30, when the city was still heavy with sleep, she brewed instant coffee, its bitterness a constant companion, and bent over her books. Financial statements, derivatives, ethics modules, lines of numbers, and rules that demanded every shred of focus. At 8, she was already on the bus downtown, a worn-out backpack slung over her shoulder, heading toward the translation office. By 9, she was buried in contracts translating words that no longer felt like art, but like code, means to an end, stepping stones toward survival. By 6, she was back on the bus, exhaustion dragging at her spine. Yet by 7, she was at the public library, the desk lamp glowing like a lone star. Until midnight, she pored over formulas, balance sheets, and risk management scenarios. Some nights, she nodded off her cheek, pressed against smudged notes, woken by the janitor's kind but weary nudge. "Miss Taylor," he would murmur, gently closing the time. And she would smile faintly, gather her scattered papers, and whisper, "Thank you." Sacrifice became her second skin. She sold the last diamond bracelet Adrian had once fastened on her wrist before a gala. She sold the sapphire earrings that had matched the gown she wore at his side when the cameras flashed. Each sale stung less than the one before. The jewelry, once heavy with meaning, now felt like anchors. Letting them go lightened her. She began renting her apartment on weekends through a listing service to save money. Strangers slept in her bed, cooked in her tiny kitchen, and left traces of lives she would never know. During those weekends, she sat on a friend's couch, clutching her notebooks like lifelines. She stopped attending social gatherings, declined coworker invitations, and avoided distractions. Loneliness pressed harder, but she bore it like armor. The price of reinvention was solitude. Marcus Reed's emails arrived sporadically, steady as footsteps in the distance. He never overwhelmed her, never demanded. His words were brief and precise. "Remember, the exam is not only about memorization. It is about endurance. Focus on ethics. Most underestimate it. Do not fear failure. Fear only the loss of persistence." Sometimes she read those lines in the dim glow of her lamp and felt her chest tighten. He didn't know how his words reached her, how they kept her upright when fatigue bent her spine and steadied her, when the voice of doubt whispered she was not enough. March arrived. The practice exams became battlegrounds. The first time she scored below the passing mark. The numbers glared at her like a verdict, tears soaking the thin pillow she curled into herself on the mattress that night. The next morning, her eyes swollen, she whispered, "Not for him. For me." She tried again and again. Each failure carved her, but each attempt sharpened her. By April, her scores began to climb, slowly, unevenly, but upward. Her body grew weary. Her hands trembled when she held her pen too long. Her eyes blurred after hours on the same page. Poor granola bars dulled hunger, and sleep fractured into restless fragments. She was often seen at the library in the same thrift store blazer, hair pulled back in a practical bun, her face pale with exhaustion. But beneath the weariness burned a light that no fatigue could extinguish. When other candidates grumbled about long hours, Stella nodded silently. She had known worse. She had lived invisibly. This was nothing compared to that silence. The exam day arrived in June. The convention center in downtown Atlanta buzzed with thousands of candidates. Rows of desks stretched endlessly. Fluorescent lights glaring above security guards pacing the aisles. Stella walked in with her head held high, though her heart pounded with brutal rhythm. She wore a simple navy blouse and black slacks. No jewelry, no symbols of wealth, only her resolve. The first session tested ethics and financial reporting. Her hand moved furiously across the paper, her pen scratching like the rhythm of survival. By the time the break arrived, her fingers cramped, her throat dry. She sat alone sipping water, staring at the floor to steady her breath. The second session, quantitative methods and portfolio management, nearly broke her. The questions twisted numbers into knots. At one point, she froze, panic flooding her chest. Around her, pens scratched. Calculators beeped. She closed her eyes and whispered, "You've faced storms worse than this. Keep going." And she did. By the end of the third session, her body trembled from exhaustion. She staggered out of the hall into the heavy summer air, the city sprawling before her. The weight of uncertainty pressed down, but she had survived. That was enough for now. The waiting was torture. Weeks dragged by, each day filled with translation work, each night haunted by the memory of questions she wasn't sure she had answered correctly. She replayed them endlessly, scribbling formulas on scraps of paper, checking textbooks, as if she could rewrite the past. Then one humid morning in August, the email arrived. She stared at the subject line, heart hammering so loud she could hear it. Her hands shook as she clicked. "Congratulations, you have passed." The words blurred as tears flooded her vision. For a moment, she laughed through the sobs, the sound breaking free from a place deep inside her. The walls of her small apartment echoed with joy. She sank onto the mattress, covering her face, her shoulders shaking. She had done it. Against statistics, against doubt, against silence. She had done it. The triumph was not only hers, it was a key. Through Marcus's quiet recommendation, she was invited to interview at Helios Capital, a global investment firm headquartered in Dubai. The offer stunned her. Dubai is a city of glass and desert, of relentless ambition and untamed possibility. The flight there felt like a pilgrimage, a crossing from the ashes of who she had been to the fire of who she would become. The Helios Tower rose above Marina, its glass shimmering like sunlight trapped in steel. Inside, the interview panel was sharp, precise, and unrelenting. They fired questions at her like arrows: risk management, market crashes, emerging economies. Stella answered with clarity. Her voice did not tremble, even when they tried to unsettle her. When they asked why she had chosen this path, after years away from finance, she looked them in the eye and said, "Because silence costs me too much. I will not pay that price again." The room went still. 2 weeks later, she received the offer. Analyst, probationary contract, a beginning. She moved into a small apartment in Dubai, overlooking narrow streets filled with the scent of spices and the call to prayer echoing at dawn. She ate noodles from vendors, rode the metro past towers that touched the sky, and immersed herself in the work. Helios was ruthless. Deadlines stretched into the early morning hours. Mistakes were punished. The competition was merciless. But Stella's hunger for growth outpaced her fear. She volunteered for the most complex assignments, devoured reports, and learned to negotiate across cultures. At first, colleagues underestimated her, a woman of color, in a world dominated by men with centuries of legacy. But quarter after quarter, her analysis proved sharper, her instincts stronger. By the end of her first year, whispers moved through the office. Stella Taylor is different. Watch her. And Stella, alone at her desk late at night, would sometimes pause, hand on her notebook, heart steady. She had walked out of a penthouse with nothing but a suitcase. And now here she was. Not finished. Not yet. But no longer invisible. Dubai was a city of contradictions. It rose from desert sand like an impossible mirage, glass towers that pierced the clouds, highways lit by neon veins, fountains choreographed to music in the shadow of mosques that had stood for centuries. The scent of oud drifted from luxury boutiques, while souks overflowed with spices and hand-woven fabrics. It was where ancient rhythm collided with modern ambition, and Stella Taylor arrived to build the next chapter of her life. Her first weeks at Helios Capital were a blur of pressure and precision. The firm's headquarters loomed over Marina Bay like a fortress of glass, its mirrored panels reflecting ambition onto itself. Inside, the atmosphere was sharp, almost surgical. Analysts hunched over glowing screens. Partners strode with clipped footsteps, and the air buzzed with conversations about billions as though they were mere commas. For Stella, every day was a trial. Her probationary contract marked her as disposable. One mistake, one miscalculation, and she would be dismissed, forgotten, before she had time to prove her worth. The men around her were older, sharper armed, with pedigrees from Harvard and Oxford. Some looked at her like an intruder, a curiosity that would not last. But Stella had carried heavier silences than their dismissive glances. She arrived before dawn, when the sky was still purple over the desert. She stayed long after midnight, her eyes burning from hours of reports, her mind sharp with determination. While others took breaks, she studied market patterns, learning the rhythm of currencies and the fragile heartbeat of emerging economies. When her supervisor assigned her to a team analyzing investment risks in Southeast Asia, she buried herself in data consumption rates, infrastructure projects, and regional politics. She built models from scratch, double-checked every formula, chased clarity with a ferocity that startled even her. The first time she presented her findings in a meeting, one senior associate scoffed at her conclusion. He said, "Your projections are too conservative," his tone dismissive, his cufflinks gleaming. Stella looked at him, steady and calm. Conservative isn't a weakness, it's survival. When markets collapse, optimism won't pay the debt. Her voice was soft but unwavering. The room stilled. Her supervisor raised an eyebrow, then glanced back at the numbers. Silence became her vindication. Hours later, when her prediction aligned with sudden regional instability, her reputation grew quietly like roots beneath the surface. Colleagues began to notice that her reports never missed critical details. Clients leaned in when she spoke, sensing the gravity beneath her words. She never shouted or sought attention, but people listened when she spoke. One morning, a partner called her into his office. The man was known for tearing apart analysts until they left in tears. He handed her a file thick with red annotations. "Review this." "You have 2 days," he said curtly. Stella took it without flinching. For 48 hours, she ate little, slept less, dissecting every flaw until the numbers revealed their truth. She returned the file on time, annotated with clarity and precision. The partner scanned it, then glanced up at her. Not bad. For a probationary. That was the closest thing to praise she would hear. Yet it was enough. She was offered a permanent contract by the end of her first year. By the end of her second year, she was promoted to senior associate. Whispers traveled through the corridors of Helios, the Iron Lady, with a velvet touch. The nickname followed her, not because she was harsh, but because she was unyielding. In negotiations, she never raised her voice, never let anger betray her. She listened measured, and then spoke her words, landing with the weight of inevitability. Her calm was sharper than steel, her grace more disarming than force. One colleague muttered after a bruising meeting that you don't argue with Stella Taylor. She'll smile at you while cutting your deal in half, and you'll thank her. Her rise was not without resistance. At conferences, men twice her age sometimes spoke over her, mistaking patience for weakness. In boardrooms, some dismissed her as a token of diversity for the firm's image. But quarter after quarter, her analyses outperformed predictions. Clients returned to Helios, specifically requesting her oversight. Competitors whispered her name in surprise when she held her ground against veterans. In Jakarta, she negotiated infrastructure deals with officials who underestimated her until she disarmed them with knowledge of their policies. In Kuala Lumpur, she walked into a boardroom where no woman had ever led the discussion and left with unanimous approval for Helios's strategy. In Bangkok, she endured 4 hours of aggressive questioning from a billionaire industrialist and won him over with logic delivered in the calm cadence of a lullaby. Every city tested her. Every deal sharpened her. Yet success carried a price. Her apartment in Dubai overlooked the glittering skyline, but she often returned home too late to notice. The hours stretched into dawn, her body running on coffee and adrenaline. Loneliness lingered at the edges of her victories. Suitors approached colleagues, entrepreneurs, men dazzled by her beauty and success, but she declined them all with polite detachment. It wasn't that she no longer believed in love. She no longer trusted love which asked her to shrink. Her heart had been silenced once. She would not allow it again. Marcus Reed remained a presence, distant, steady. Occasionally, she received an email from him. Saw your panel at the Singapore summit. You commanded the room. Don't forget, rest is also part of resilience. Proud of how far you've come. Sometimes, she replied with brief gratitude. Sometimes she didn't. But his words always lingered like a quiet anchor against the storms. At a conference in Geneva, they crossed paths for the first time since Atlanta. He greeted her with a smile, his presence unchanged, calm, patient, unthreatening. They spoke briefly about markets and resilience. But beneath their words hummed something unspoken, a current neither dared name. When they parted, he pressed a book into her hand. For when numbers aren't enough, he said. Inside his handwriting marked the first page, the mind builds, but the heart sustains. She carried the book back to Dubai, setting it on her desk. When exhaustion blurred her vision some nights, she traced the words with her fingertips. Her 3rd year at Helios tested her more than any exam. She was placed in charge of a regional portfolio worth hundreds of millions. The responsibility was staggering. Every decision she made rippled across economies. Mistakes were no longer personal. They were monumental. Her team resisted her at first. Senior analysts bristled at taking orders from someone they once considered their equal. One even muttered, "She'll crack under pressure." She didn't. Instead, she worked alongside them, never above guiding with quiet certainty. She demanded excellence but offered clarity. She cut through disputes with fairness, but never softened the truth. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to follow her lead. By the end of the fiscal year, her portfolio had outperformed expectations by 20%. Helios recognized her not only as a leader, but as a force. She was promoted again, Director of Regional Investments, standing in her office overlooking Marina Bay, the skyline glittering beneath her. Stella sometimes thought of the girl who had once walked out of a Chicago penthouse with nothing but a suitcase. That girl had been invisible, erased by silence. Now her name carried weight across continents. And yet, in the quiet of her apartment, she sometimes wondered what it meant to rise so high if no one stood beside her to share the view. Late one evening, after a grueling negotiation in Jakarta, Stella sat alone at a rooftop bar, the city sprawling beneath her like a constellation. She sipped ginger tea, her body heavy with exhaustion. Her phone buzzed. An email. From Marcus. Resilience is not only surviving storms, it's knowing when to rest between them. She smiled faintly, tilting her head back to the sky. Stars blinked above, distant but constant. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I am no one's shadow." And for the first time she believed it fully. The rain in Singapore was unlike the storms Stella had known in Chicago. Here it was warm, sudden, and almost theatrical sheets of water, cascading down glass towers before dissolving into mist under tropical sun. She stood by the window of her office on the 40th floor, watching the city blur into silver. Beneath her, Chinatown pulsed with color, the scent of incense curling into the air. Beyond, Marina Bay shimmered with ambition, cranes rising like sentinels of progress. Her name now lived in rooms she had never entered. 3 years ago, Stella Taylor had walked into Helios Capital as a probationary analyst, disposable, underestimated. Now her signature closed deals across Southeast Asia. Her analyses shaped strategies from Hong Kong to Nairobi, and her voice commanded attention in boardrooms where few women had ever spoken. The press had taken notice. Financial journals published her essays on resilience in volatile markets. Television anchors spoke her name with reverence. The Iron Lady with a velvet touch. They called her a paradox that fit her perfectly. She was both steel and silk, discipline and grace. Stella never chased the spotlight, but the spotlight found her. Her days blurred into a rhythm of airports and negotiations. She guided a logistics investment through political turbulence in Jakarta with quiet precision. In Nairobi, she secured a renewable energy deal that stunned competitors. In Frankfurt, she dismantled a rival firm's strategy with logic so sharp it left them reeling. She moved like a tide, calm on the surface, unstoppable beneath. Her colleagues marveled at her stamina. Investors leaned closer, eager for her approval. Competitors watched warily, wondering how a woman once invisible now reigned with such poise. Yet for Stella, triumph was never about applause. Each success was a stone laid on the path she had promised herself. The night she walked out of Adrian Stewart's penthouse, "I will never be invisible again." But power was a lonely companion. Her apartment in Singapore overlooked the bay, its walls lined with books and notebooks filled with strategies. Yet the space felt transient, like a hotel room she never truly inhabited. Her schedule left little time for friendships. Suitors appeared, drawn by her beauty and aura, but she dismissed them politely. They saw her as an emblem, a conquest, or a reflection of their ambition. None saw her as she was a woman who had rebuilt herself from ashes, scarred but unbroken. She remembered too well what it felt like to love a man who demanded silence. She would never trade her voice again. Marcus Reed's presence remained steady, though distant. He sent her occasional notes, thoughtful, brief. "Read your interview in the Financial Times." Clear and sharp. Resilience does not mean carrying everything alone. I hope you're finding moments of stillness. Sometimes their paths crossed at international summits. Geneva, London, Singapore, always in professional corridors, always with words wrapped in the language of markets. Yet beneath the formality lingered something unspoken. After a panel on global debt in London, they had walked by the Thames. The city lights shimmered on the water. Marcus handed her a cup of tea, his fingers brushing hers lightly. "You remind me," he said quietly, "that strength can be gentle too." She had looked at him, then startled by the sincerity in his eyes. Something stirred inside her for a moment, a warmth she had long kept locked away. But she tucked it aside, uncertain if she was ready to open any door. Despite her guarded heart, whispers began to follow her. A profile in Forbes Asia described her as a strategist, reshaping the future of cross-border investment. The Wall Street Journal noted her ability to blend intellect with elegance, commanding respect without force. At conferences, younger women sought her out, asking for advice, their eyes lit with hope. "You don't have to sacrifice your voice to succeed," she told them softly. the truth carved from her scars. For Stella, that was the legacy she wanted more than wealth or power, to show others that resilience was not silence, but strength spoken aloud. And yet, despite all her victories, her past had not finished with her. Adrian Stewart's name still appeared in headlines with photographs of Claire at galas and charity balls. Miller Global Holdings expands in real estate. One headline read, "Stewart secures a $400 million deal and announces another." His empire thrived. His face smiled from magazine covers. She told herself it no longer mattered. She had buried that chapter. But whenever his name flashed across her screen, a flicker of memory tugged the penthouse storm, the silence she left behind. She pressed the thoughts down, reminding herself, "I am no one's shadow." The moment came in late spring. Her assistant entered her office, a file in hand, her expression taut with excitement. "Director Taylor," she said, "the delegation from Washington has confirmed. The negotiation will be in 2 weeks. You'll be leading." "Washington." Stella repeated, her brow furrowing. "Yes, with Stewart Global Holdings." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Stella felt the room tilt for a heartbeat, and the floor shifted beneath her. She steadied her breath, her gaze fixed on the skyline beyond the glass. Rain streaked down the window, warm against the pane like silver veins cutting through the city. Her voice, when it came, was calm. "Prepare the agenda. This will be business as usual." But inside, a storm had already begun. That evening, she sat alone at her desk after emptying the office. The city hummed below, lights flickering across the bay. She opened her leather-bound notebook, the one she had carried since Atlanta, its pages filled with equations, notes, and dreams. At the back, she found a line she had written years ago. "Don't forget, you are more than someone's silence." She traced the words with her fingertip, steadying herself. Facing Adrian Stewart would not be about revenge. It would be about proving to him, the world, and herself that she had risen beyond the shadow he once cast. The rain outside intensified, tapping against the glass like a countdown. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Adrian Stewart was celebrating another triumph. In New York, he stood at the center of a ballroom, champagne in hand, cameras flashing. Claire smiled at his side, her gown glittering under the chandeliers. His name rolled off the tongues of investors, journalists, and politicians. He had built an empire vast enough to swallow cities. Yet beneath his polished exterior, a weariness lingered. Success had not quieted the echoes of his past. Some nights, when the rain pressed against glass windows, he remembered Stella. Her laughter soft as a secret, her dreams whispered in half-sleep. He silenced the memories with scotch, with pride, with the mantra he repeated to himself. She was ordinary. Claire belongs here. But the words grew hollower with each passing year. And soon in Washington, the truth he had buried would walk through the door no longer. Ordinary, no longer his, but formidable in her own light. The world was preparing to watch. Financial outlets buzzed with speculation about the Washington deal. Analysts debated the partnership between Helios Capital and Stewart Global Holdings. The contract was valued at $400 million, enough to shift markets, to define legacies. Reporters whispered about Stella Taylor, the woman leading Helios's delegation. One said she's known for being unyielding. If Stewart underestimates her, he'll regret it. Stella ignored the chatter. She focused on her team, her strategy, her preparation. But in the quiet of the night, when she closed her eyes, she felt the weight of inevitability pressing against her chest. The storm was circling back. And this time, she would not walk away in silence. The morning air in Washington carried the weight of summer, thick, pressing, as if even the sky held its breath. The city's glass towers glimmered with early light steel spines, catching fire beneath the sun. Beneath their shadows, a boardroom awaited in the heart of the Capitol. Mahogany gleamed leather chairs, stood in solemn rows, and screens glowed ready to project numbers that would decide the movement of millions. Adrian Stewart entered first. His stride was measured, polished, the walk of a man accustomed to victory. His tailored suit was flawless, his cufflinks discreet, yet unmistakably expensive, his steel-gray eyes carrying the weight of 1,000 headlines. 3 years had sharpened him broader shoulders, finer lines of authority etched into his face, a more profound gravity in how he carried himself. Yet beneath the surface, fatigue lingered, an ache he never admitted. He took his seat at the head of the table, exhaling softly. This deal mattered more than most. $400 million was the cornerstone of Miller Global's expansion into Asian real estate. Shareholders watched with ravenous eyes. Reporters speculated with feverish tongues. Today, his triumph needed to be undeniable. The doors opened. His secretary leaned close, whispering, "Helios's delegation has arrived." Adrian nodded. He rose, smoothing his tie, preparing the practiced smile of partnership. He extended his hand toward the entrance. Then he heard them. Footsteps, measured, certain, heels striking marble with a rhythm that seemed to alter the very air. When she stepped inside, the world shifted. Stella Taylor. The name struck him silently, before the image did the syllables echoing in the hollow chambers of memory. And then she was there no longer, the woman who had walked away in a Chicago storm, with a single suitcase, but someone entirely transformed. She entered flanked by 2 associates, a translator and a legal counsel, but they blurred into insignificance. Stella was the axis around which the room revolved. Her hair, once loose curls against his pillow, was swept into an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. A white suit framed her figure, tailored with precision, understated yet commanding. Her skin glowed with quiet confidence, her lips touched with a shade of rose that spoke of restraint rather than vanity. But it was her eyes that undid him. Deep, steady. They flickered to his for the briefest second, long enough to pierce, short enough to wound, before moving past him, as if he were no more significant than the chandelier overhead. Adrian's breath caught almost imperceptibly. His hand, half raised for a handshake, faltered. The last time he had seen her, she was walking away into a storm, her ring left glittering on a table. Tonight she walked in, as Helios's representative, the one holding the pen that could alter the destiny of his empire. He forced composure back onto his face, sculpting the faintest smile. "Director Taylor," he said the words taste foreign and brittle. "Welcome." Her reply was poised, professional. "Thank you, Mr. Stewart. I'm here on behalf of Helios Capital to discuss the proposed terms." Nothing more. No tremor of old affection, no flicker of bitterness. Only diplomacy, smooth and exact. And in that composure, Adrian felt something inside him tighten. The meeting began. Slides lit the screen's charts, unfurled projections of risk and reward. Voices from both sides spoke with rehearsed precision. But Adrian found his focus fraying. Every time Stella leaned forward to make a point, every time her pen moved gracefully across her notes, he felt the ghosts of memory pressing in. Her laughter in their kitchen, the patience in her eyes when he returned late, the warmth of her hand against his wrist the night before his first billion-dollar deal, the silence she left behind. For 3 years, he had buried these echoes beneath ambition. Yet here she was, resurrecting them with every measured breath. He studied her with discreet glances, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the girl who had once sat cross-legged on their sofa, reading market reports aloud, while he half listened. Her jaw was stronger now. Her composure is impenetrable. She no longer bent toward anyone's gravity. She was her own. At one point, a shareholder raised concerns about the risks of overextension in Asian markets. Adrian braced for Stella to defer to her team. Instead, she answered directly, her voice steady, eloquent. "Helios believes risk does not lie in markets, but in leadership unprepared to adapt. We back companies that recognize when to expand and when to restrain. Resilience. Mr. Stewart is as valuable as ambition. Her gaze flickered to him long enough for the words to cut deeper than any blade. The room applauded her point. Adrian clenched his jaw, covering the sting with a sip of water. Inside, a storm churned. By noon, the meeting recessed. Executives filed out for calls and coffee. The room emptied until only they remained. Stella closing her laptop with meticulous grace. Adrian watching her with a gaze that betrayed too much. He spoke before he could stop himself. Stella. The name slipped out soft, almost reverent, almost pleading. She paused. Back straight, head slightly tilted. She turned slowly. Her expression remained unreadable, but the sound of her name on his lips, after 3 years, hung like forbidden music. Yes, Mr. Stewart. Her tone was deliberate, formal. He searched her face, desperate for even a sliver of softness. It's been a long time. Her eyes did not waver. 3 years and 11 days to be exact. But I didn't expect you to be counting. The words landed like a blow. He hadn't been counting, not consciously, but something inside him knew she had, that every day since she left had been marked, etched into her with precision. Silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of what was unsaid. He wanted to tell her. He had thought of her every night when rain fell against glass. That he had silenced his regret with pride that Claire's laughter had never drowned out her absence. But pride is a cage of its own making. He could not unlock it. Instead, he said almost helplessly, "You look different." Her lips curved faintly, not in a smile, but in acknowledgement, sharp as glass. Yes, I am. With that, she turned her heels, striking the floor with a rhythm that declared she belonged to no one but herself. Adrian sat frozen, the echo of her footsteps slicing through him. The second half of the meeting was even more grueling. Terms were dissected, clauses debated, and strategies tested. Stella's composure never faltered. She guided her team with precision, cut through disputes with calm logic, and measured every compromise against Helios's standards, not his desperation. Adrian felt the balance shift. Once, she had been the silent shadow beside him. Now he was the one bending to her gravity. His CFO leaned in at one point, whispering, "She's formidable." Adrian's gaze never left her. "Yes," he said quietly. "She always was." By evening, the session ended with no final agreement. The terms were left open and subject to further negotiation. Helios's withdrawal was not declared, but the possibility lingered like smoke in the air. Executives rose, hands extended, smiles exchanged. But Adrian barely noticed. His gaze followed Stella as she gathered her notes, her calm, unshaken, her presence commanding. Not as a rival, not as a partner, but as the woman who had once lain beside him, who had once believed in him, now stood untouchable. When the room emptied, Adrian lingered. He stared at the chair she had occupied, the ghost of her composure still etched into the leather. His vast and glittering empire felt fragile, not because of the deal, but because for the first time he realized no wealth could summon her back. Outside, dusk settled over Washington. The city lights blinked awake, casting gold across the pavement. Stella stepped into a waiting car, her team following. She slid into the seat, exhaling softly. The faint echo of Adrian's voice whispering her name clung to her ears. Her heart, though steady, betrayed her with a single flutter. But she steadied it. She opened her eyes, looked ahead. She had faced him. She had proven herself, and she would not look back. The storm between them was far from over. It had only begun. The Stewart estate in Boston was carved from stone and legacy. It stood on a hill above the Charles River, its marble staircases sweeping upward in grand arcs, its chandeliers scattering prisms of light across polished oak floors. Every room echoed with the weight of old money of generations that had built empires from iron and ambition. For most, it was a sanctuary of triumph. For Adrian Stewart that night, it felt like a mausoleum. He walked through the vast entryway with the stride of a man still outwardly powerful, yet inwardly fractured. The Washington meeting had ended without resolution. No deal, no triumph. Only the quiet, relentless memory of Stella Taylor's voice, her calm unshaken, as she dismantled his empire's certainty. Her eyes had met his with a composure that left him restless. That single look had done what rivals' losses and failures could not. It had unsettled him to his core. He loosened his tie, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous silence. The air smelled faintly of roses from the garden outside, though their sweetness felt wasted against the cold stone. In the drawing room, his mother waited. She sat upright in a high-backed chair near the fire, her silver hair swept elegantly back, her pearl necklace gleaming against the dark silk of her dress. Time had etched fine lines into her face, but her eyes sharp, calculating, remained untouched by age. Adrian. She greeted, her tone clipped, as though his very name carried reprimand. You've caused quite a storm. He exhaled, sinking into the chair opposite her. The fire crackled, casting restless shadows across the room. He said, Elian's hesitation is temporary, though the words lacked conviction. We'll close the deal. His mother studied him for a long, piercing moment. Then softly, with a calmness more lethal than anger, she said, You've underestimated them. Or rather, you've underestimated her. The words sliced deeper than intended. Adrian's jaw tightened. His gaze lifted sharply. You know. A faint, humorless smile touched her lips. Of course I know. Stella Taylor. The wife you dismissed, the woman you believed was too small for this world, and now she sits across from you as the embodiment of power. Irony has a cruel sense of timing. Adrian's chest constricted. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm himself against a chill that had nothing to do with the fire. Why now, Mother? He asked hoarsely. Why speak of her as though you admired her? You never did. You never once welcomed her into this house. Her silence was confirmation enough. The fire popped, sending sparks upward. Finally, she said, her voice lower. I didn't. I never thought she belonged here. Not with you. Not in this world. He looked at her, pain flickering in his eyes. And yet, she belonged everywhere else more than I ever realized. The admission tasted bitter. It sat on his tongue like poison. His mother's gaze shifted, softening just barely. She reached for a small lacquered box on the table beside her, her hands trembling in a way he had never seen. From it, she drew an envelope yellowed slightly with time. She slid it across the table toward him. Adrian frowned. What is this? Something you should have known years ago, she said quietly. Something I kept from you. He opened the envelope with hesitant fingers. Inside lay a cashier's check. The ink had faded, but the numbers were still bold. $2 million. The sight jolted him like a physical blow. His pulse stumbled. His breath grew shallow. I don't understand, he murmured. His mother's eyes did not waver. Do you remember the week before she left? The arguments, the silence between you. You thought it was indifference, but it wasn't. Adrian's throat tightened. What are you saying? Her voice broke slightly, the first fracture in her armor. I gave her this. $2 million. I told her that if she truly loved you, she would walk away for your sake and the future you deserved. Claire's family was willing to invest in Miller Global, but only if you severed ties with Stella. It was their condition. a brutal one. I pressed that check into her hands and told her that leaving was the greatest gift she could give you. The words slammed into him like thunder. Adrian sat frozen, the check trembling in his grasp. His mind raced backward, spiraling through memories he had buried. The night he came home, he found the divorce papers had already been signed. The ring glittering on the dining table was left like an afterthought. Her silence as she closed the door for the last time. He had told himself she left because she was weak, because she didn't belong, because she no longer loved him. But it had been a sacrifice, a forced exile. His chest tightened until he could barely breathe. You. His voice cracked hoarse with disbelief. You bribed her to leave. I called it protection, his mother whispered, though her eyes glistened. She wasn't from our world. She would have dragged you down. At least that's what I believed. And you never told me. His voice rose a mixture of rage and despair. Her gaze faltered. What difference would it have made? You were already drifting from her. You were dazzled by Claire's circle, by their power, their promises. Stella saw it. She didn't fight. She didn't beg. She only took the check and disappeared. And I thought, her voice trembled, I thought it would be best for you. Adrian's vision blurred. The fire's light wavered. He rose suddenly, pacing toward the window. Outside, the garden lay still under the pale glow of moonlight. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, hollow-eyed, broken. Then his mother's voice, soft and unsteady, pierced him again. She didn't even cash it. He turned sharply, stunned. I checked. She admitted, her tone heavy with something dangerously close to remorse. The money never left the account. She walked away without touching a cent. She wasn't bought. She was broken. The silence that followed was unbearable. Adrian's thoughts spiraled. He remembered the nights she waited for him with dinner gone cold. She had folded her dreams into the corners of herself so his ambitions could shine brighter. The eyes that had softened when they looked at him, even as he drifted farther away. He had mistaken her silence for weakness. Now he understood it had been strength. Strength to walk away when love was no longer enough. Strength to sacrifice her happiness for his future. Strength to endure a wound so deep it left her invisible. And he had let her go. He had let her vanish without asking why. Adrian sank back into the chair, burying his face in his hands. His chest heaved, every breath jagged. All these years, he whispered, his voice breaking. I thought she stopped loving me. I thought she was ordinary. And the truth is, I was the one who failed her. For the first time, Adrian Stewart felt minor. Not the heir to empires, not the titan of Wall Street, but a man unraveling under the weight of his own blindness. His mother watched him, her expression unreadable. For perhaps the first time she saw her son not as the prodigy she had sculpted, but as a man crushed beneath regret. You still have your company, she said gently, almost pleading. You can recover. Adrian lifted his head, his eyes burning with something sharper than sorrow. The company. His voice was raw, almost a growl. Do you not see I lost more than a deal? I lost the only person who ever saw me, not as Stewart Global's successor, not as Claire's fiancé, not as a headline. She saw me, and I threw it away. That night, long after his mother had left him alone, Adrian poured himself a glass of whiskey he could not drink. He wandered through the estate, its halls echoing with ghosts. A photograph he had not touched in years rested on a shelf in his study. Stella's smile radiant on their wedding day. Sunlight caught in her hair. He traced the frame with his fingertip, his chest aching with a heaviness that refused release. He whispered her name into the empty room. The silence that answered was the cruelest sound of all. Los Angeles glittered differently from New York or Dubai. Ambition wore a brighter smile, cloaked in golden sunlight, stretched endlessly over palm-lined boulevards. The air smelled of salt from the Pacific and gasoline from congested highways, the city's rhythm pulsing with dreams and reinvention. Stella Taylor arrived for the Global Finance Summit as one of its most anticipated speakers. The hotel where the summit was hosted towered above Wilshire Boulevard, its glass walls shimmering in the late afternoon light. Cameras flashed as she entered the ballroom, journalists whispering her name, as though she were a force of nature rather than a woman. The Iron Lady with a velvet touch. One headline had called her the night before a strategist whose grace unsettles even the fiercest boardrooms. She wore a gown of understated elegance, navy silk flowing like water. Her hair swept back to reveal the quiet dignity of her face. When she spoke at the opening dinner, her voice carried with calm authority, weaving numbers into vision strategy, into poetry. Applause followed her like a tide. But the tide was about to turn. The next morning, the first headline struck. Stella Taylor, under investigation for misappropriation of funds during early career in San Francisco. By noon, the story spread like wildfire. Allegations claimed that during her time at a small tech startup, Stella had siphoned money through translation contracts manipulating accounts for personal gain. Blogs multiplied the rumor. Social media erupted with speculation. Investors, cautious and restless, began calling Helios capital. By evening, the whispers had become a roar. Hashtags trended. Commentators dissected every line of her past. Rivals circled their voices dripping with false sympathy. Inside her hotel suite overlooking Beverly Hills, Stella sat at the edge of the bed, laptop open, her face calm as marble. Her assistant paced the carpet in panic. "They're tearing you apart online," the assistant whispered. "Shouldn't we release the statement?" Something, anything to push back. Stella closed the laptop slowly, her hands deliberate. Not yet. Her voice carried no tremor, though inside she felt the faint stirrings of betrayal. She knew these accusations were not random. Someone had orchestrated them. Someone had waited for the moment she stood tallest so they could strike hardest. And deep in her intuition, she already suspected the shadow behind it. Across the city, Adrian Stewart read the headlines from the quiet of a penthouse suite. His chest tightened as he scrolled each word, cutting deeper than the last. He had not written these articles, but he recognized the details, fragments of Stella's early career, pieces of information only someone close to him could have known. Claire, or Claire's allies. The memory returned sharply. A night of whiskey, bitter words exchanged his careless tongue, offering memories of Stella's first job. At the time, he had dismissed it as inconsequential, an indulgence in resentment. But now he realized his silence afterwards had been permission. His words had become weapons, and those weapons had been turned against her. Adrian felt shame burn hotter than pride for the first time in years. By the second day, the storm worsened. News anchors replayed clips of Stella's speeches, questioning her integrity. Investors hesitated. Rumors grew teeth. Had her rise been built on deception? Had Helios Capital been blind to her past? Yet Stella remained silent. While the world shouted, she studied. She and her legal team worked in quiet precision, tracing the accusations, unraveling the origin of falsified documents, and finding the threads of manipulation. She knew the truth would surface, but truth required timing. In the middle of the chaos, Marcus Reed arrived. He stepped into her suite without ceremony, his presence steady as ever. His eyes met hers, and Stella allowed the mask to soften for the first time in days. "You didn't have to come," she murmured. "I did," he replied. "You're not fighting this alone." His words settled into her chest like a balm. He sat beside her for hours, reading through files offering counsel, his loyalty quiet but unshakable. He was not a man of grand gestures, but of presence. And presence in moments of fire was everything. "Then stay," she whispered. And he did. For 2 days, Stella said nothing publicly. The media spun louder. Critics sharpened their knives, but she refused to defend herself with empty words. Instead, she gathered evidence, bank records, contracts, testimonies. Each piece was another stone in the foundation she was building. On the third morning, she called a press conference. The ballroom of the Summit Hotel was packed with journalists, cameras flashing like relentless lightning. Reporters leaned forward, eager to capture the fall of a woman who had soared too high. Stella entered in a charcoal gray suit, no jewelry, save a simple silver ring on her right hand. She walked to the podium with measured grace, her every step a declaration. When she spoke, her voice was steady, deliberate. 3 days ago, allegations surfaced accusing me of misappropriating funds during my early career in San Francisco. Today, I will not only answer those allegations, but dismantle them. She displayed documents verified by independent auditors showing that not only had she not embezzled, but that she had in fact flagged irregularities in the company's accounts at the time. Her dismissal years ago had been retaliation for whistleblowing, not evidence of guilt. What some call betrayal, she concluded, her gaze sweeping the room, I call courage. I did not steal. I stood against theft, and I will do so again as many times as necessary. The silence that followed was thick, breathless. Then applause erupted, not polite, but thunderous, relentless. Cameras captured the calm on her face, the strength in her stance. Overnight, the narrative flipped. Stella Taylor, vindicated, a whistleblower, not a thief. From scandal to hero. How Stella rose above the fire. Markets rally as Taylor emerges, stronger than ever. The storm that had threatened to consume her had become her crown. Across Los Angeles, Adrian watched the broadcast in silence. On the screen, Stella stood unshaken, her grace slicing through lies with surgical precision. In her strength, he saw his own weakness reflected. He remembered the night he had let Claire pry into Stella's past, his bitterness feeding her curiosity. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty room. But apologies spoken to walls meant nothing. They could not undo the damage. That evening, Stella returned to her suite. Exhaustion pressed heavily against her shoulders, but her composure never cracked. Marcus was waiting by the window, the city lights reflecting in his calm eyes. "You were brilliant," he said softly. She set her folder down, slipped off her heels, and sat across from him. For a moment, silence stretched comfortable, steady. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. It was him. Marcus's brow furrowed. "Adrian." She nodded. He gave them the pieces. Maybe not the whole story, but enough to hurt. He may not have written the lies, but handed them the keys. Marcus knelt before her, his hands cupping hers gently. "Then he doesn't deserve another moment of your pain." Her lips trembled, but she steadied. "He's already taken years. He won't take more." Later, when the city slept, Stella stepped onto the balcony. The wind was cool against her skin, carrying the faint hum of Los Angeles nightlife. Marcus joined her quietly, standing at her side. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "if the past will always follow us?" He looked at her with unwavering calm. "The past doesn't follow. We carry it. But we choose how heavy it becomes." Her eyes glistened, not with tears, but with clarity. She allowed herself to lean for the first time, not in surrender dependence, but trust. And for the first time in years, she did not feel alone. The morning fog clung to San Francisco like a secret unwilling to lift. The Golden Gate Bridge rose from the mist, an iron ghost stretching into pale skies. The streets shimmered with dew cable cars rattled along their ancient tracks, and the city felt suspended, half dream, half judgment. Stella Taylor's car rolled silently through the financial district toward the glass tower of Miller Global. Her reflection stared back at her in the tinted window, composed, steady, immaculate in a dark navy suit. Yet beneath the surface her pulse carried the rhythm of an old wound that had waited 3 years for this morning. On the seat beside her lay a folder. Inside it proof. Not conjecture or rumor, but documented evidence tracing the smear campaign in Los Angeles's origins. Accounts, email, chains, names. And at the end of the trail, Adrian Stewart. The driver slowed. The tower loomed above them, its steel frame disappearing into fog. Once this building had been a symbol of power she could never touch. Today, it was merely another address. She stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement, each step a declaration. The lobby of Miller Global was all glass and steel, cold elegance designed to intimidate. Employees looked up as Stella entered, their eyes following her with recognition. Her face had graced too many headlines to mistake. Whispers rippled through the air. The woman who had dismantled accusations in Los Angeles now walked their halls with purpose. Security escorted her to the executive floor. The elevator hummed as it rose, each second tightening the silence inside her chest. She held the folder lightly, as though it weighed nothing, though she knew it carried the gravest of truths. When the doors opened, the air seemed to shift. Outside the boardroom, Adrian Stewart stood waiting. He looked older, not by years alone, but by burdens. His suit was immaculate, his posture proud, but his eyes betrayed fatigue, the hollowness of a man who had spent too long fighting shadows. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It was heavy with everything unspoken, everything lost. At last, Adrian inclined his head. "Stella." Her response was measured. "Mr. Stewart." The formality in her tone sliced deeper than disdain. It told him he was no longer anything more than a name on her agenda. They entered the boardroom together. Executives shifted uneasily as the two figures took their places, Adrian at the head, Stella across from him. The arrangement mirrored their meeting in Washington, but the balance of power was unmistakable this time. Stella opened the folder. She slid the documents across the polished mahogany table, her movements precise, deliberate. "These," she said calmly, "are records of the accounts used to seed false allegations against me in Los Angeles. The trail leads here to you." Gasps murmured around the room. Eyes darted toward Adrian. He stiffened his hand, tightening on the armrest. "I never." Her gaze cut him off sharp as steel. "Please, please do not insult me with denial. You may not have written the lies but handed them the keys. Out of pride, out of bitterness." The silence that followed was suffocating. Executives shifted, uncertain whether to intervene, but none dared break the moment. Adrian's composure cracked. His voice, when it came, was rough. "I was angry. I was weak. But I never meant for it to destroy you." Stella leaned forward, her eyes steady, her tone calm but edged with fire. "Intent does not erase consequence. You gave them weapons. They tried to bury me with them. That is your legacy, Adrian." His name on her lips, spoken not with tenderness, but with finality, landed like a verdict. Adrian's mask slipped. He pushed back his chair, rising abruptly. His voice rose not with authority, but with desperation. "I lost you once," he said hoarsely. "I thought success would fill the void, but it didn't. I watched you rise higher than I ever imagined, and I hated myself for letting you go. That night, those words I gave away, they weren't betrayal. They were a cry I didn't know how to silence." His eyes glistened, But Stella's gaze remained unwavering. "You mistake confession for redemption," she replied softly. "But redemption is not yours to claim. Not here. Not with me." Her words struck harder than any shouted accusation. They were true, delivered without malice, without pity. Adrian's shoulders sagged. For the first time, he looked less like a titan of Wall Street and more like a man undone by his blindness. Stella gathered the documents and put them back into the folder. She rose gracefully, her presence filling the room with quiet authority. She said Elion Capital has no further interest in ties with Miller Global. Our investments will be redirected elsewhere. This is not vengeance. This is clarity. A company built on instability cannot be trusted. Her words sealed the deal and the man's fate across from her. Adrian closed his eyes, the weight of finality pressing down like stone. Stella paused at the doorway as the executives filed out in tense silence. She turned back her gaze, meeting his one last time. "You once told me I was ordinary," she said softly. "But the truth is, I was extraordinary, and you never saw it. That was your blindness. And now, it is your burden." Her voice did not tremble. It was not sharp with anger, nor soft with longing. It was a verdict spoken by a woman who had outgrown the need for revenge. Adrian's lips parted, but no words came. He remained frozen as she walked out, her heels echoing down the corridor, each step the sound of closure. Outside, the fog had begun to lift. Sunlight pierced the mist, glinting off the steel and glass of the tower. Stella stepped into the light, the folder tucked under her arm. For years, she had carried the shadows of their past. But as the morning brightened, she realized she no longer carried them. They belonged to him. In the boardroom, Adrian remained seated long after everyone else had gone. The documents lay scattered before him, the evidence undeniable. His hands trembled too much to gather them. The empire he had built no longer felt like a power. It felt like a mausoleum of choices that cost him everything that mattered. He whispered her name just once into the silence. The echo that returned was hollow. Judgment. That evening, Stella stood by the window of her hotel overlooking the bay. The water shimmered with the last light of dusk, the bridge glowing like a string of fire across the horizon. Daniel called. His voice was steady, grounding. "How did it go?" Stella's gaze lingered on the horizon. "It ended." "Do you feel lighter?" She considered her hand brushing the glass. "Not lighter. Stronger. Sometimes strength is not carrying more, but finally setting something down." Her words were not for him, nor for the world. They were for herself. The fog of San Francisco clung to the city, even as her plane lifted eastward the next morning. Stella sat by the window, her reflection faint against the glass, her eyes tracing the horizon, as if bidding farewell not to a city, but to a chapter of her life. The confrontation had not ended with rage or tears, but with silence. The kind of silence signaled finality. She had delivered the truth, reclaimed her dignity, and left him with the weight of his choices. And in speaking, she had set herself free. The sky over Singapore glowed with the gold of late afternoon, the sun hanging low above Marina Bay, its reflection dancing across the water like liquid fire. From her office window, Stella Taylor watched the horizon, her heart steady, her mind clear. Months had passed since San Francisco. Months since she had placed the final period on her story with Adrian Stewart, not in fury, grief, or calm truth. She had carried her silence long enough. Now it belonged to him. And with that burden set down, Stella was free. The freedom did not mean rest. Stella had never been built for idleness. Her days flowed with the urgency of someone determined to leave behind more than numbers on balance sheets. She had founded a new venture, the Lumina Fund, a global initiative investing in women-led enterprises across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. For Stella, it was more than strategy. It was a legacy. The idea had come in a quiet evening, her fingers resting over her journal. Daniel's words echoing, "Strength is not carrying more. It's knowing when to set something down." She had set down her past. Now she would lift others. Helios supported her, but this was Stella's vision, her creation. She traveled to Nairobi to meet a young engineer who was designing solar lamps for rural villages. She sat cross-legged in a hut in India, listening to a suist describe her dream of exporting hand-woven fabrics. She walked through markets in Lima, laughing with women whose hands carried children and ledgers. Each story, each handshake, each smile reminded Stella of the girl she once was, bright with ambition, yet nearly silenced. Never again, she vowed. Not for me, not for them. The media crowned her anew. Stella Taylor, architect of change. From survivor to visionary. How Taylor builds futures. Lumina Fund shines a light on women across the globe. But Stella wore the headlines lightly. Applause had never been her hunger. What satisfied her now was the sight of women stepping into rooms where no one had expected them, speaking with voices that could not be ignored. And in those moments, Stella felt her own healing deepen. Daniel Carter became an increasingly steady presence at her side. He did not rush her or demand more than she could give. He walked beside her through airports and conferences, late-night strategy sessions, and quiet dinners where silence spoke louder than words. One evening in Paris, they strolled along the Seine after a long day of meetings. The city glowed in the soft blush of twilight, its bridges strung with golden lights. Daniel carried 2 paper cups of tea, handing one to her with that familiar gentleness. "You never stop moving," he said softly, smiling as she sipped. Stella tilted her head. "Neither do you." "True, but I've learned something." His gaze found hers, steady, unwavering. Even the strongest need someone to sit beside them when the world grows quiet. For a long moment she held his eyes. Then, with a rare softness breaking her composure, she whispered, "Stay beside me." And Daniel, without hesitation, answered, "Always." Their love unfolded not with fireworks, but with constellations, small, steady lights, each one illuminating a path forward. He did not try to eclipse her brilliance. He honored it. He did not ask her to shrink. He encouraged her to expand. Together, they became not halves of a whole, but 2 complete beings choosing to walk in tandem. And Stella, who had once sworn never to trust love again, found herself building a life where love was not silence, but partnership. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Adrian Stewart sat in his Manhattan penthouse, surrounded by glass and steel, yet stripped of warmth. The fallout from San Francisco had been brutal. Investors withdrew. Board members questioned his leadership. Miller Global trembled, its foundations cracked not by markets, but by the man at its helm. Adrian still commanded rooms, still wore his armor of tailored suits. But behind the polished exterior, he was unraveling. He read headlines of Stella's triumphs, photographs of her at summits, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. Each image pierced him not with jealousy alone, but with recognition. She had become what he once dismissed extraordinary, and he, for all his wealth, was diminished. Nights stretched long. He poured whiskey he could not finish, stared at photographs he could not bear to frame. He whispered her name in the silence, but it echoed back, hollow, judgmental. Adrian Stewart had built an empire of glass, and now lived inside its emptiness. The wedding was small, almost startling in its intimacy. A garden in Tuscany, vines, heavy with summer grapes, the scent of lavender drifting through the air. Only a handful of guests, close friends, partners who had walked beside Stella, women whose ventures she had funded, colleagues who had become family. Stella wore a gown of ivory silk, luminous and straightforward. Her curls framed her face soft and unbound. Daniel stood waiting beneath an arch of roses, his eyes steady, filled with awe. When she walked toward him, the world seemed to still. Vows were exchanged, not as declarations, but as promises carved into the marrow of their beings. "I don't need you to complete me," Stella whispered, her hand in his. "I need you to walk beside me, as you always have. And I don't want to lead or follow you," Daniel replied, his voice low with emotion. "I only want to stand where you stand for as long as we both draw breath." When their lips met, the following applause felt less like a celebration and more like a benediction. Once invisible in silence, Stella Taylor was now radiant in love, chosen freely. Months later, Stella sat by the window of their home in Singapore, her hand resting lightly on her belly. Daniel entered quietly, carrying tea, his eyes softening as he saw her gaze far away. He said gently, "They'll be here soon enough," setting the cup down. She smiled faintly. "Twins. Can you believe it?" "I can," he said, slipping his arm around her shoulders. "Because you've always carried more than most could, Stella. But now it's not a burden. It's a gift." Her eyes glistened. For once, tears did not fall from pain, but from joy. The world continued to know her as the Iron Lady with a velvet touch. They wrote of her strategies, brilliance, and fun that reshaped markets. But to those closest, she was simply Stella, the woman who had endured storms, had walked away from shadows, and had rebuilt not only her life, but the lives of countless others. And to Daniel, she was the woman who laughed softly in the mornings, leaned against him during quiet evenings, and carried within her the promise of their future. Far away in New York, Adrian Stewart stood at the window of his empty penthouse, watching snow fall over the city. He drafted letters he never sent, confessions he never voiced. He had once called her ordinary. He now knew she had always been extraordinary. But knowing did not change the truth: she was gone. And the silence he had once forced upon her was now his own. On a bright spring morning, Stella sat at her desk, a pen in hand, her twins stirring gently within her. She wrote in her journal, her words flowing with quiet conviction. "I thought I had lost everything the day I signed the divorce papers. But I had only lost the version of me that forgot how to love herself. Today, I am not defined by what I lost, but by what I chose. Dignity, courage, love. And that has made all the difference." She closed the book, exhaling softly. Outside, the world thrummed with ambition. Inside, she carried both serenity and promise. Stella Taylor was no longer a woman in someone else's story. She was the story. And this time, she would share her light not as someone's shadow, but as her own sun.